Good afternoon, and thank you for the invitation. Our Lady of the Angels Cathedral, Urbanism, Phenomenology, and the Sacred. Oops. There we go. The celebrated Cathedral of Our Lady of the Angels in Los Angeles marked its 10th anniversary of consecration on September 2nd, 2012. No other recent ecclesiastical building has been so thoroughly disseminated and critiqued, even castigated. Three agents together, the city, the patron, Cardinal Roger Mahoney, and the architect, Rafael Maneo, constituted a triad out of which the cathedral emerged not only as significant ecclesial architecture, but also important urban architecture. The stakes were high for each agent, with local, national, and international reputations at risk. A greater risk, perhaps, was and is the credibility of the phenomenological claim that asserts an enduring need and role for sacred architecture as a bearer of meaning within the urban context, even as contemporary culture ostensibly seeks what the architectural historian Kenneth Frampton refers to as secularized spirituality. The contemporary philosopher Carsten Harries claims in his essay, Untimely Meditations on the Need for Sacred Architecture, that the sacred needs architecture if it is not to wither, and that similarly architecture needs the sacred. His meditations include an invitation to move beyond seeing the contemporary age as the age of the decorated shed, a metaphor borrowed from Robert Venturi. His underlying intent is clearly directed to an acknowledgement that what the world needs is not a decoration of reality from which meanings and values are excluded, but a window to what transcends that reality, a window to the sacred. Harries believes that architecture can create such a portal through a binding back of aesthetic creativity to the sacred, a return to that binding measure of responsible freedom which grants weight and substance to human life expressed in architecture. This presentation will examine the Cathedral Our Lady of the Angels as a means of explicating Harries' twofold claim that the sacred needs architecture and that architecture needs the sacred. The exercise will be framed by a phenomenological reading of the cathedral, not as an object or as a phenomenon within the concept of the natural landscape, but in relation to its urban context. Harries' essay provides an entry point by mapping how sacred architecture places the human person and community within time and space. He asserts that what distinguishes Lincoln Cathedral from its circumscribing architecture is more than just a building with an added aesthetic component that performs a representational function, where a substantial public place of assembly deemed worthy of the community's material investment has been transformed into a venerable aesthetic object. Lincoln Cathedral witnesses to that which was valued as most profound and meaningful in life by those who accommodated, those who commissioned, and those who designed the building. The cathedral as the material object is then seen and experienced as an implanted presence from the past, proposing an authentic community life in the present and promising eternal bliss in the future. Lincoln Cathedral is perceived to embody what Harries calls figural significance for the community, and so is endowed with unique resonance, weight, and substance. Within this context, Harry likens the experience of the sacred to a vertical which intersects our quotidian horizontal lives, disposing individuals and communities to the transcendent in a particular time and place. Mircea Eliade employs similar axial terms to describe the intersecting character of the sacred within time and space. Sacred space is interruptive and inherently fecund, pregnant with further interruptions. This interruptive nature reveals an absolute reality and discloses a center, a central axis for all future orientation. Sacred space's interfering character establishes a conduit of communication between the heavenly and earthly realms to establish that this place is distinct from that place. Sacred ritual centered around this vertical axis mundi disposes each person to participation in the cosmos, the ultimate source of existential meaning and value. Sacred space is then experiential. Christianity embraces in a particular way the geometry described by Harries and Eliade. This is the point of the incarnation. divinity takes on human flesh to be embodied in a unique and historical person, so that humanity may be in communion with God, the vertical, and with humanity itself, the horizontal. For Catholic Christianity, the mystery of this union in which humanity is the image of the invisible God gives new meaning and value to human materiality. Arriving from beyond time, as it were, the Los Angeles Cathedral's immense concrete cross, rather than simply dominate, gives deference to the sanctuary's life-size crucified humanity of Christ in bronze. Here, the extraordinary embraces the ordinary. Embodied humanity is now holy. Harry's insistence on the permanent union of spirit and matter as constitutive of the sacred, that vertical intersecting the horizontal, is then anticipated and actualized. At the same time, Catholicism asserts that all time and all space are blessed and suffused with holiness, and so assumes that the sacred finds expression in a diversity of forms. Catholicism not only perceives and experiences the transcendent in this particular time and place, but also comprehends the world and life itself as inherently sacred. Within this cosmology, Catholicism affirms the human need for ritual environments that constitute what Aldo Rossi describes as a constellation of singular points of intense encounter with the sacred. Here, Catholicism orders these singularities through its liturgy to create built forms that, as Rossi says, in the very act of being constituted, are transcended and go beyond the functions which they must serve, to attend to the divine's immanence within the created order. Sheltered and supported by sacred architecture, Catholic liturgy transcends time as it invokes the future eternal life with God by bringing the past, God's entry into human history in the person of Christ, into the present, communion with Christ. In this way, the liturgy shapes the gathering of the individual and the Christian community throughout time as a horizontal movement forward to encounter the vertical movement of God downward. The Los Angeles Cathedral and its ritual marking of time as a union of material and spirit is then experienced as Harry's intersection, or Eliada's interruption, of this place with transcended space and time to become sacred space, where the curtain, as Pope Benedict said, where the curtain of temporality is raised. Our Lady of the Angels Cathedral is such a singularity. The visitor is choreographed through a measured progression of elevational changes of ascent and descent throughout the site. The rhythmic pacing of the asymmetrical concrete piers, the alabaster glazing in the nave with its animation of light and shadow revealing a myriad of textures, and the linear detailing of the ceiling with its many intersecting angles reading like a tinted roof, frame a kinetic and sensory experience of space. Here, the visitor is led through what this faith tradition understands to be a hallowing of time and space by the cathedral's subtle architectural cadences, which in themselves witness to the divine's immanence permeating the material world. Harries looks to Walter Benjamin's writing to describe the experience of the sacred in architecture as that which necessarily transcends our capacity to produce or reproduce it. Reproduction is understood here to be a rending of architecture from its historical context and rootedness in the fabric of tradition, destroying the aura of a work of art. While a shared faith narrative around which past individual and communal lives were formed and sustained can no longer be assumed, the substitution of the aesthetic for the sacred within contemporary architecture is incapable of creating a contemporary sacred architecture. Aesthetic appeal, defined architecturally here as a self-sustaining aesthetic whole, free of all contradiction, and where all external conditions must be deemed significant obstacles, is not enough. For such an architectural modus operandi is indifferent to sacred transcendence and is opposed to every contextualism. Buildings that invite cloning are buildings that lack a certain rootedness in particular contexts, appear as ready to travel, and as such are what the French anthropologist Marc Auger refers to as non-places that are everywhere and nowhere. Buildings with such weakened identities and indifference to transcendent experience render such architecture incapable of spiritual shelter. That's Harry's term. Such transient and apathy sever the critical link between architecture and the sacred. The implication for Harries is a fallout of history and a loss of place for contemporary architecture. Given contemporary culture's attachment to the promises of the Enlightenment, where human reason alone is the final arbiter of reality and meaning, and which presuppose to reproduce reality back into our concrete lives, Harries notes that it is no surprise that this reality is increasingly experienced as devoid of transcendence and lacks any place for the sacred. The substitution of the banal for the sacred within contemporary culture is then inherently ironic. Contemporary life seems to have need of what it has inherited to decorate a life that seems impoverished without such embellishments, all the while displacing the sacred's aura for ascetic appeal, beautiful, or just interesting mass, according to Harries. Contemporary culture's memory and its memories of meaning are impoverished and further compromised as the non-place increasingly directs the ordering of individual and communal living. Yet for Harries, sacred architecture is place-establishing architecture that looks to provide not only functional shelter, but also what I would describe as soul shelter. Sacred architecture is not simply a meaningless material envelope housing ritual activity, nor is such architecture meant to manifest a definitive containment of the sacred. Sacred architecture is holistic architecture, attending to and communicating with the body, mind, and soul to become what Sigurd Bergman characterizes as a living space for the art of surviving. Sacred architecture is then a memorable countercultural measure, asserting that the spiritual and the material of architecture are not mutually exclusive. Rather, both inform and animate each other. Both are intrinsic to a process that seeks to actualize integrated and resonant space. The Cathedral of Our Lady of the Angels' commanding presence next to the Hollywood freeway is a case in point. The cathedral supports and effects an intentional remembering as it embeds memory through the ritual choreography of the visitor's body and time and space, all framed within a structure that offers the potential for encountering immanent meaning and the transcendent. Throughout the cathedral interior, one notices in the vertical concrete surfaces the vestiges of 12 crosses. They are remnants of the cathedral's anointing during the rite of dedication and ritually mark the structure and volume as a weighted and substantive space. The crosses have been absorbed into the cathedral's walls and remain forever visible as traces of sacred markings. They architecturally embody the permanent union of spirit and matter, and so are empowered spiritually and physically to witness to new meaning and value imparted to mundane materiality. I think you can see the cross. The sensory resonance of the cathedral, its aura, persists within the body, mind, and soul long after one has left the building. This is the aura of transcendence that constitutes authentic sacred architecture and consequently is central to Harries' twofold claim that the sacred needs architecture and that similarly architecture needs the sacred. Harries' claim that sacred architecture is place-establishing architecture finds support in Kenneth Frampton's discussion of the phenomenon of universal placelessness. Frampton looks to Martin Heidegger's definition of boundary, which is not where something stops, but as he says, as the Greeks recognized, the boundary is that from which something begins its presencing. Resisting this phenomenon of universal placelessness is predicated upon a defined or bounded domain, which in its public manifestation is the bounded place form that empowers the built form. Christian Norbuck Schultz expands Frampton's concretizing of this presencing by employing Heidegger's concept of dwelling to describe architecture as a means for humanity to establish an existential foothold, where dwelling in an existential sense is the purpose of architecture, where architecture is a means to visualize the spirit of the place, or genius loci, where to create meaningful spaces is to help humanity to dwell. Norberg Schultz defines this existential dimension in terms of place, where place represents architecture's share in truth and the concretization of humanity's dwelling, both of which inform humanity's identity. This identity is spatially defined by structuring the human environment with what he refers to as objects of identification that transcend the historical situation. The human person experiences its environment as meaningful when the environment is accessible, when the human person feels at home because he or she can orient themselves within their environment. This orientation is predicated upon Heidegger's condition of dwelling. The cathedral community dwells in this place because of the cathedral's presencing that, in an existential sense, becomes the purpose and orientation of its architecture. In this sense, Our Lady of the Angels Cathedral becomes Heidegger's thing, which gathers the world, offering the world more than a framework for meaning, but an encounter with the source and architect of that meaning. If cities have the capacity to enable place identity, as Philip Sheldrake claims, then the monumentality of the Cathedral of Our Lady of the Angels and its plaza as an ordered, urban, and sacred precinct actualizes such an urban faculty. The cathedral precinct reads as one large stage where processional movement immerses and choreographs visitors in the measured act of an individual and communal earthly pilgrimage to become a subliminal communication with the embodied memories of visitors. This is not a flight into a dematerialized world, but an invitation to enter another world where Christianity has a particular capacity to hold unity and multiplicity together. The cathedral's massive concrete cross enters the cathedral's east end along a 45-degree descent oriented to the altar. The cross of the interior space is then projected out through the structure to the exterior to become a focal point on the east facade of the cathedral. The cross asserts that the interiority of the spiritual life and the exteriority of everyday life are not fragmented experiences, but are a seamless reality, thereby manifesting yet another of Harry's intersections where the binary nature of interior and exterior is effectively transcended. A complete environment is revealed, the visitor is oriented, and so the potential meanings on offer within this place are accessible. Both Cardinal Mahoney and Maneo understood well the capacity of the cathedral as presencing architecture to allow individuals and the community to bring their interpretation and imagination and that of the community's faith tradition to the building, thereby, as Maneo says, endowing the architecture with the power to be a new vessel for sacred experience. The Cardinal remembered that the current Hollywood freeway, the northern boundary of the site, covers part of the historic California Mission Trail, which connected over 25 Catholic missions. In the site selected for the cathedral, Moneo recognized the resisting potential described by Frampton, its location on the cultural axis of Grand Avenue, its excellent visibility, its easy accessibility within the city, its autonomous and yet integrated urban character. The cathedral's plaza establishes a preparatory and transitional space before the visitor must make a decision to enter the cathedral. The brilliance of Maneo's processional architecture, both exterior and interior, and his inversion of the basilica plan is realized as one processes forward along the side ambulatories and then turns back toward the altar. The individual who has left the world behind is then reoriented back to that world to ponder its present state and to envisage its future through the transcendent lens of the sacred. The act of ringing the cathedral bells extends its walls to establish an acoustical place and becomes a temporal icon of sound within the city. Here, Frampton's place form, referred to above, is combined with the body's competency to interpret the environment with all its senses and faculties. Such bell ringing is but one sensory example of the cathedral's particular presencing, and by extension, the concretized structuring of that presence in relationship to the neighborhood and the urban fabric of the city. The Cathedral of Our Lady of the Angels offers the city something more profound than another reinforcement of orderly urban living. It speaks to and embraces the needs of human living and the profound attendant questions about meaning at the subjective and objective levels. The cathedral is a transcendent image represented within the here and now to embody what is not only perceived, but also experienced and remembered to be of figural significance. It manifests a significant contribution to the long continuum of Christian architecture, which in itself is a dynamic architectural pilgrimage and relationship seeking to give ongoing expression to humanity's encounter with the immanent, the transcendent, the totally other. Clearly, the cathedral offers an alternative interpretation of reality as an enduring measure of reality to a city perceived as an urban environment in search of a communal identity. The cathedral is a sensory religious interpretation of reality embodied within an architectural and liturgical narrative, both of which provide a sustaining context for that interpretation to become an urban text offered as what Paula Kane refers to a spiritual and urban resource. Despite the potential for the dismissal of or indifference to the cathedral's interpretation, it remains an interpretation nonetheless, one that is persistent and that continues to resonate with meaning for a multitude of Angelenos. Contemporary culture risks the impoverishment of its memory and its experience of meaning when it fails to at least entertain this interpretation like it would any other. Harry's title on timely meditations on the need for sacred architecture is a misnomer. If anything, his meditations are timely. The sacred needs architecture, and architecture needs the sacred. Thank you. Whoops.